Opening up diagonals for the queen and bishop immediately challenges central control and sets an aggressive tone. Mirroring the opponent establishes symmetry, setting the stage for a classical battle for central control and piece development. Developing a knight to attack the central pawn immediately applies pressure and prepares castling. Developing a knight to its natural square, defending the pawn and preparing for central pawn breaks creates a robust opening foundation. Instantly aiming at black's central pawn. This maneuver seeks to disrupt black's knight development and create lasting pressure. Gambiting space. Black immediately questions the bishop's placement, forcing a decision about its future. Preserving the bishop's influence on the long diagonal maintains pressure on black's kingside. Development. Undermining white's bishop's influence. This knight aggressively challenges the center and prepares for castling. Securing the monarch offers immediate safety, freeing white to develop a more aggressive central pawn push or explore maneuvering possibilities. Seeking to challenge white's bishop and gain queenside space, black initiates a pawn thrust that opens up diagonal lines for further development. Retreating the bishop preserves its scope, creating a slightly awkward pawn structure for black who has overextended on the queenside, while maintaining pressure along the long diagonal. Unlocking the c8 bishop's potential. This development strategically reinforces the e5 pawn and prepares for future queenside expansion, while simultaneously creating a slight imbalance in piece activity. Fortifying the center and clearing the path for the queen to potentially join the attack. This move subtly prepares for a pawn push later. Unleashing the bishop to c5 opens up the diagonal towards white's king and actively challenges the centralized knight, creating immediate tactical possibilities and drawing attention away from any potential central pawn advances. Confronting the pawn chain. White aims to disrupt black's queenside foothold and exploit potential weaknesses. A bold territorial gambit that opens lines and demands immediate attention from the opponents. Pieces to avoid a collapse. Securing the monarch heralds the end of early development, allowing for a more ambitious queenside expansion or even a central thrust now that the king is safe. Harnessing the bishop's influence to pin the knight. This move initiates a subtle positional squeeze, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses in black's queenside pawn structure after the recent pawn advances. Challenging the bishop's influence on the kingside. Black signals an intent to question white's pawn structure, potentially forcing the bishop to retreat and opening up lines for their own pieces. This prophylactic maneuver, while seemingly simple, introduces a subtle strategic tension that will ripple through the game's developing phases. The retreat of the bishop to h4 signals white's intention to preserve the bishop pair, a potential long-term advantage, while simultaneously probing black's kingside. This maneuver aims to maintain pressure and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's pawn structure after the pawn push. It's a positional concession, trading the immediate attacking potential of the bishop on g5 for sustained influence. Exposing the kingside to such an extent with g5 is a daring but potentially double-edged decision, immediately creating dynamic play and challenging white's central control, though it does leave black's monarch in a precarious position if not handled with extreme care. Reasserting central influence. The bishop's redeployment to g3 not only guards the knight but also prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm, aiming to dislodge black's aggressively advanced pawns. Solidifying the center. Black reinforces the d6 pawn, an essential anchor for their pawn structure and a key defender of the e5 pawn, all while preparing to potentially reroute their knight to d7 for improved mobility. reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for a potential d4 advance. This knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing the d5 outpost and bolstering the e4 pawn's defense against any immediate queenside incursions. Launching the pawn forward to b4 seizes significant central space and immediately challenges white's bishop on b3, forcing a decision. This aggressive pawn thrust disrupts white's harmonious development and opens up the possibility of queenside expansion. It gains crucial squares for black's pieces, particularly for the c6 knight, which now has more avenues for activity. The pawn on b4 also acts as a springboard, potentially supporting further advances or creating weaknesses in white's pawn structure. It's a move that injects dynamism into the position, demanding precise calculation from white to avoid falling into tactical traps or suffering a permanent positional disadvantage. Unleashing the knight to d5 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking possibilities. White is eyeing the weak squares on the queenside, particularly c7, and may be preparing to sacrifice material for an initiative. This aggressive maneuver forces black to react immediately, potentially leading to an unbalanced game with rich tactical complexities. Observe how the knight's new outpost constrains black's pieces and hints at future pawn pushes or even a decisive exchange. Initiating a dynamic counter-thrust, black bravely dislodges the pinned knight, forcing white's bishop to retreat and thereby opening a new diagonal for the knight's potential activity. This maneuver cleverly repositions the piece, aiming to challenge white's control of the queenside and potentially create imbalances that can be exploited later in the game. The exchange on d5, if it occurs, will clarify the pawn structure and may lead to a more open position, which black seems prepared to handle, liberating the c3 knight from its protective duties. This exchange offers a chance to simplify while potentially weakening black's kingside pawn structure. The knight's retreat to the edge of the board after recapturing will create a more harmonious pawn formation for white, giving them greater control over the central squares and opening pathways for their remaining pieces. Reclaiming the queen to the center allows her to influence both wings and prepare for potential skirmishes, while also safeguarding the vulnerable f6 pawn. Retreating the bishop to a2 might seem passive, but it neatly sidesteps the immediate pressure from black's pawn storm, allowing white to consolidate and prepare for a more positional middle game. Observe how the bishop now supports the central d3 pawn and prepares to redeploy along the second rank if the opportunity arises. This maneuver also hints at a potential queenside expansion later, aiming to exploit the backward c6 pawn. Consider the dynamic possibilities this creates. Black's queenside is somewhat exposed, and the bishop on a2 can become a potent attacking piece should white manage to open up lines, instantly disrupting the bishop's comfortable perch on a2. This pawn thrust creates a cascade of positional re-evaluations. Black seizes the initiative by forcing the white queen to relocate, simultaneously opening a vital pathway for the queenside majority. Aiming to exploit the queenside space advantage black has meticulously built, the pawn's advance demands immediate attention, potentially drawing further white pieces away from the center, which could prove crucial for the ensuing middle game battle and could even hint at a future pawn breakthrough on the queenside. Seizing the initiative, white captures the pawn, injecting immediate tactical complexity into the position and forcing black to re-evaluate their queenside structure. A bold capture aimed at disrupting white's pawn structure. This exchange sacrifices material for immediate tactical possibilities, potentially opening lines and creating weaknesses around the white king if white isn't careful with their counterplay. Reclaiming the pawn on b3 solidifies white's central structure and opens the c-file. A valuable asset for potential future king side pressure should black commit to castling that way. This pawn recapture, while seemingly simple, creates a new pawn island for black and addresses the earlier queenside pawn push, preventing further infiltration and strengthening white's pawn chain. The queen's repositioning to e6 signals a desire to contest the now open c-file and potentially the vulnerable kingside pawns, while also seeking a safer haven from the immediate d-pawn advance. Asserting dominance over the c-file is the primary objective, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure and prepare for a potential pawn storm or piece infiltration. Black injects immediate dynamism into the position, aggressively challenging white's central presence and aiming to break open the kingside where white's king remains. This pawn thrust, while creating immediate imbalances and potential weaknesses, is a bold attempt to seize initiative and disrupt white's carefully constructed setup. The ensuing complications will likely revolve around controlling the newly opened diagonals and files, and whether black can effectively coordinate their pieces to exploit the potential fissures in white's structure before white can consolidate. This capture dramatically reopens the c-file, instantly placing white's rook on a very active square and creating immediate pressure on black's position. The exchange, while seemingly materializing the pawn structure, has fundamentally altered the dynamic, offering white a clear advantage in control over that critical vertical. Consider how this shift in initiative might restrict black's piece mobility, potentially forcing uncomfortable defensive maneuvers. Sharpening the tactical focus, black redirects the queen to the open d-file, potentially preparing to exploit the doubled pawns on the c-file while simultaneously eyeing the kingside. Unleashing central energy, this pawn thrust aims to shatter black's pawn chain and create immediate dynamism, potentially opening lines towards the king. Snatching the pawn on d4 opens up a tactical vista, but it's crucial to evaluate if the king's safety is compromised in the process. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately disrupts black's carefully constructed pawn chain, creating fascinating tactical possibilities and forcing a concession of material or a critical positional weakening. Reclaiming the rook to defend the vulnerable 7th rank, rf7** endeavors to solidify black's defensive structure and prepare for potential counterplay down the newly opened c-file, a pragmatic response to white's aggressive pawn sacrifice. White's queen boldly enters the fray, aiming to disrupt black's centralized bishop and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. The rook's sacrifice on c7 ignites a volatile exchange, forcing a stark evaluation of material versus initiative. The white queen powerfully reclaims its dominant position on the c7 square, not only recapturing material but also initiating a significant spatial squeeze against black's cramped forces, particularly threatening the vulnerable king's defenses and potentially dictating further pawn structure exchanges that favor white's development. Re-establishing the rook on the open file after the exchange offers a counterbalance to white's central queenside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination. Instead of recapturing immediately on b3 and potentially simplifying into a less favorable position, white strategically aims to maintain central pressure and coordinate pieces. The queen's redeployment to c2 conserves this piece for potential defensive duties or to support an advance on the queenside later, while keeping the c-file contested. This also prepares for future pawn breaks that could disrupt black's structure, offering a subtle positional advantage by delaying the inevitable material resolution and seeking tactical opportunities. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing the kingside and potentially supporting a future pawn push with c5, while also keeping an eye on the central squares. A bold repositioning of the rook, aiming to activate it on the open file and challenge black's defensive structure. Black's bishop, now untethered from the c5 square, aims to join the fray on the queenside, threatening white's d2 pawn and adding pressure to the b3 pawn, potentially disrupting white's structural integrity. Initiating a rook maneuver to potentially exploit the open d-file. This move aims to reposition the rook and prepare for further central action, perhaps challenging black's centralized pieces or preparing a kingside advance. Reclaiming initiative. Black seeks to leverage the open c-file and pressure white's slightly exposed king. This exchange simplifies the position by removing the most active queen, often a prudent choice when faced with potential tactical complications, especially given the open c-file now available for white's rook. Black consolidates control over the now open d-file, establishing a strong outpost for the bishop. Re-establishing knight centralization is the immediate goal, preparing to contest the now open d-file and potentially probe black's somewhat exposed king. The pawn at f5 now actively contests the center and creates a potential outpost for a knight, forcing white to consider its immediate safety. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure suddenly becomes paramount, as the rook on the c-file now possesses potential mobility, and the knight's return to the center offers a much-needed defensive outpost. Consolidating forces along the open file provides a robust counter-strategy, leveraging the newly established pawn structure to limit white's maneuvering space and prepare for potential pawn advances. Unleashing a pawn storm against black's now exposed king. This move sacrifices central control for immediate attacking potential on the kingside. Reclaiming central space and improving piece mobility are the primary objectives here, aiming to unlock the queenside and potentially threaten pawn advances. A cunning repositioning. The knight abandons its central outpost to menace the d6 pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pieces and potentially open lines for white's rooks. Snatching the pawn on b3 immediately creates an unbalanced pawn structure. Now, black has a clear path to open the c-file with the coming rc8, while white's queenside pawns are potentially isolated. Securing the rook on the open file. This maneuver aims to prevent black's bishop from becoming a menace on the queenside and prepares for potential queenside expansion by white. Grasping at the last vestiges of initiative, black retreats the bishop, hoping to activate it on the open diagonal. Yet it seems an act of desperation, sacrificing tempo for a piece that may well be out of play for the remainder of the game given white's control of the central files and the ongoing repositioning of white's knight to a more central and menacing square. Opening the h-file might seem like a bold attempt to create attacking chances against black's exposed king, but it simultaneously risks weakening white's own pawn structure and could invite unwelcome counterplay on the newly opened avenue. The king's path to safety is now clear of immediate threats after recapturing the pawn, allowing for the queen to potentially become an active piece again. The rook's journey to the queenside aims to contest the open a-file, a potentially crucial battleground as the game simplifies, though it abandons the defense of the kingside pawns for the moment. Seizing the initiative, the bishop now occupies a highly active square, directly threatening white's rook and aiming to disrupt its defensive duties on the queenside. Unlocking the kingside pawns demands careful calculation. Activating that bishop offers a fresh perspective on the tangled queenside skirmish. A bold defiance. This check forces white's king into a precarious situation and unlocks the powerful bishop from its Confines. Aiming to exploit the exposed diagonal leading towards white's royal family. Securing the bishop on f2 offers crucial defensive support, solidifying your kingside against any immediate threats and preparing to redeploy the piece to a more active square should the opportunity arise. Perhaps to a wing or center where it can influence critical diagonals. The bishop's repositioning to d2 offers a new defensive screen for the king, while simultaneously preparing to potentially redeploy to the c3 square, aiming to contest the central control that white's pawn structure has established. This subtle shift aims to solidify black's position and explore potential counterplay on the queenside, where white has managed to create some space. Reshuffling the bishop back allows white to keep the initiative and prepare for potential endgame transitions while also preventing black's bishop from becoming too dominant on the c2 square. The black bishop vacates its long-held outpost, a move that feels like a cautious surrender of the queenside's immediate attacking potential, paving the way for a more straightforward, though perhaps less dynamic, endgame where white might gain a slight initiative through controlled piece placement. Reclaiming the knight opens up the diagonal for the queen to support the pawn advance and potentially create an outpost on the 6th rank if the bishop on e3 can be dislodged. Exerting pressure on the pinned knight, this piece now stands poised to disrupt white's fragile pawn structure by targeting the vulnerable f2 square, potentially forcing concessions or a retreat. Pivoting the rook to the b file initiates a shrewd attempt to infiltrate black's back rank and disrupt their pawn structure, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses created by the earlier exchanges. Bringing the king to the center of the board is a bold choice in this complex position. It signifies a willingness to embrace the inherent risks of open lines and potential tactical skirmishes, prioritizing an active role in the game's unfolding drama. Instantly pinning the bishop to the king creates an immediate tactical dilemma for black, forcing a reaction that will either disrupt their coordination or lead to material concession. The black king ventures forward, seeking a more active role in this complex middle game, but it opens up potential lines for the rooks and knight to exploit. The pawn storm on the queenside seems to be stalling, so white attempts to open a new front by advancing the a-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt black's queenside structure. The rook's journey to the first rank offers a new dimension, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially activate its own pieces beyond the current blockade. Activating the king offers a glimmer of hope, pushing it from its passive stance to participate in the fray and potentially contest the now open files. The rook is rerouting towards the queenside, aiming to challenge white's advanced pawn and potentially create threats on the a-file if white is not careful with their king's safety in the approaching endgame. Attempting to create space on the queenside with that pawn push may prove to be a tactical gamble, given the active black rook and the compromised pawn structure. The bishop's repositioning aims to eye the vulnerable kingside pawns and prepare for potential pawn pushes like g5, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Activating the knight from its passive post on g2 aims to improve its defensive capabilities, specifically by guarding the kingside and preparing for potential opposition to black's advancing pawns. Pouncing on the opened diagonal, black's bishop now eyes the white king's shelter with renewed purpose, harnessing the knight's repositioning for kingside activity. This maneuver seeks to improve the knight's central influence and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn advance or a swift redeployment to a more active square like f5, disrupting black's solid structure and potentially exploiting the slightly exposed king. Fleeing the exposed b3 pawn, black repositions the bishop, seeking a safer harbor and eyeing potential outpost squares on the queenside, even if it temporarily vacates the d2 square. Unleashing the knight to its most active square yet, this move injects immediate tactical possibilities into the position, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black king and pressure the advanced pawns. Snatching the pawn with the rook opens up the queen, forcing a dramatic exchange and simplifying the board towards a potential rook endgame where black's centralized king might prove a target. Seeking refuge for your monarch, the king sidesteps the advancing rook and its potential diagonal threat. The black king ventures out, a bold foray from its protective castling position, seeking activity in the open plains of the central chessboard. The threat of the rook now looms large over the black king, forcing a reaction that will likely involve sacrificing material to escape the immediate danger. The king's journey to the queenside, now forced by the rook's menacing presence on the 7th rank, reveals a desperate attempt to consolidate, unleashing a pawn storm towards the black king, aiming to create immediate attacking threats and disrupt black's solid defensive setup. Unleashing a timely check, black aims to disrupt white's consolidating position and potentially force a pawn advance or a reshuffle of defensive pieces, hoping to exploit any remaining weaknesses around the king or create passed pawn opportunities. The monarch bravely steps forward to face the encroaching opposition, seeking refuge amidst its own pawns while aiming to support the newly activated rook. Seizing control of the vital 7th rank with the rook might seem tempting, but it abandons any defensive presence around the vulnerable monarch. The rook's aggressive foray towards the kingside now forces black to confront its immediate threat, a stark reminder of the king's exposed position. Sacrificing the rook to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay along the open files seems to be the primary intention here, a bold attempt to complicate matters rather than passively defend. The rook now occupies the 8th rank, a classic strategic goal, aiming to infiltrate black's position and exploit any weaknesses that have developed. The desperate gambit of pushing the pawn forward offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to create a passed threat and perhaps distract the adversary's powerful rook from its centralized position. Opening the king's path is paramount now. The rook's placement is less critical than securing the monarch's safety. The king's predicament is dire. Black's discovered check forces a desperate retreat, hoping to shuffle it out of danger, but the rook's advance threatens to seal its fate on the diagonal. Sacrificing the rook to lure the enemy king into a mating net feels desperate. Initiating a desperate push for the white king's safety, this pawn lunge seeks to deflect attention and disrupt white's coordinated attack by drawing the king into potential danger. Disrupting the enemy's king's shelter with a timely check offers a path to simplification and potential counterplay. Black's king, suddenly exposed, desperately seeks refuge amidst the chaos, hoping to escape the pincer of white's rook and knight. The rook's repositioning to the 2nd rank now eyes the entire long diagonal, aiming to create decisive mating threats against the exposed black monarch. Embracing the rook's newfound activity, the black rook on b3 immediately presses deeper into white's territory, forcing a decision on how to contest the a-file and potentially setting up further infiltration or exchange. The rook finds an active outpost on the 1st rank, preparing to support the kingside advance or contest the open c-file. The rook ventures to the 2nd rank, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn if it can secure the b-file. The knight hops to d4, a centralizing maneuver, eyeing the pawn on b2 and offering a timely exchange that could simplify the position towards an endgame where white might have an edge. initiating a desperate pawn push. This move sacrifices tempo and positional advantage for a fleeting glimpse of attacking potential. A devastating check that rips open the kingside, forcing a desperate response. Reaching for this square desperately aims to create a safe haven for the king. Yet the inherent danger of a doubled pawn advance on the kingside continues to be a glaring vulnerability. The knight dances to d4, aiming to dislodge that pesky black king from its comfortable square and forcing it back into the center, a position of considerable peril. The knight's patrol on the queenside is effectively contained, forcing a retreat to a less threatening square. Initiating a discovered attack, the knight's relocation forces the black king into a more vulnerable position, potentially setting up further tactical sequences. The king tucks itself into the corner, seeking temporary refuge from the relentless pressure, a desperate attempt to consolidate defenses amidst the storm. The rook now forces the black king to a desperate corner, creating a situation where escape is impossible and a swift checkmate is imminent. This maneuver to confine the white king's mobility is a desperate, yet potentially clever, attempt to generate counterplay on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn or at least disrupt white's advancing pawn storm. Initiating a cyclic repetition to force a draw now that a perpetual check has been established. The black king, now feeling the pressure of the white rook's menacing presence, seeks refuge on the only available square that offers a sliver of breathing room. A vital repositioning to evade immediate danger and prepare for further defensive maneuvering. Securing the passed pawn's advance. This capture disrupts black's kingside setup and creates an immediate threat of further infiltration. The rook's persistent threat now forces the white king to abandon its protected square, creating immediate exposure and potential for further king hunts. Seeking an escape route, the white king abandons the center, venturing towards the queenside, hoping to evade the aggressive black rook and its looming threats. Securing the rook is paramount here, as it now boasts a significant presence on the first rank, ready to support potential advances or defend against white's persistent king hunt. The knight's arrival at c7 injects a swift new threat, probing the weakened pawn structure and disrupting black's defensive lines, forcing a re-evaluation of piece placement and defensive coordination. Securing the rook's position on the back rank after white's pawn push creates a potential for counterplay and aims to consolidate black's material advantage. The king's journey to safety is nearly complete, a stark contrast to the earlier skirmishes on the queenside, now shifting towards the king's shelter. Rethinking the defensive structure after the rook sacrifice. The black king's journey to the queenside looks like a desperate scramble for safety.